COVID-19 has changed many things for many people. There's virtually nowhere in the world today where the pandemic has not created some kind of disruption. For many, it's a human tragedy and an economic crisis. But is it also an environmental crisis? Has COVID-19 affected our relationship with the environment and the natural world around us? Some have argued that COVID-19 has been good for the environment. It's reduced pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and made air quality healthier. Some would go so far as to say that it has allowed us to better appreciate and renew our relationship with nature and the natural world, and to better understand how human activities have been detrimental to natural environments. COVID-19 and similar pandemics, climate change, drought, flooding, and wildfires seem to indicate that our world is becoming less stable, that we're crowding out nature and destroying the planet in the process. COVID-19 perhaps reflects a profoundly broken relationship with our environment. Today, I've asked Mark Dickinson, School for the Study of Canada at Trent University, and Michael Classens, School of the Environment, to join us for a conversation about COVID-19 and the environment. Contemplating and Consuming Nature in Context of COVID-19 is the title of our conversation, and I am your moderator, Heather Nicol, Director of the School of the Study of Canada. The question we address is whether or not the COVID pandemic provides an opportunity to think differently about nature and the natural world and the inequalities that characterize its exploitation. I'm going to turn our conversation over to our panelists now, beginning with Mark Dickinson and the School for the Study of Canada. Mark?
Well, it's great to be here. Good to see the two of you. Everything I'm about to say, I would base in the local context from which I'm speaking, sort of, Midtown, Peterborough, Central Ontario. It's very difficult, I think, in these times to universalize, given that this pandemic has affected different areas and different people so differently. I would start by saying that it's easy for us to think of ourselves as cut off and isolated from one another at this time. And I'd actually argue against that and say that we're not. We're more connected than we think we are. And I'm not talking about together alone, and I'm not talking about living a better digital life, but about recovering a meditative way of being in the world that has been practiced by human beings for millennia, and that this particular pandemic has given us an opportunity to recover. The basis for my remarks are an exercise that I do in the second year course, Canada, the Land, at Trent. And this is the sitting spot assignment. What I do is I have my students choose at the beginning of each semester a location out of doors, someplace preferably where non-human beings outnumber the human ones. And I ask them to visit that place at least once a week. I ask them to think about the course materials in relationship to that place. In particular, the works of the field naturalist Drew Monkman, who's written a spectacular book, a guide to nature's ear in the Kawarthas, but then also to think through the particular academic readings that we have as well. That's the explicit curriculum. That's the explicit objective. The implicit objective is to provide them with a place where they can bring to conscious awareness the relationships that sustain their lives, a place where they can think through the deep events that they've lived through, and a place to think about the deeper personal work that they're undertaking as young people making their way through the world. This particular project, this particular exercise, the sitting spot, was actually suggested to me by one of my former Indigenous Studies students back when I taught in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Trent. And behind her suggestion, there's an age-old tradition that speaks to Indigenous pedagogy and character formation and so on. I'd like to read you a couple of quotes from students in the journals they've been keeping at their sitting spots throughout the course of this pandemic. The last of their assignments just came into me a few days ago. So here's one student writing from Southern Ontario, where she's quarantining with her family. She says, "The birds in the trees do not know we are in a pandemic. They carry on as they are. While I exist in an unsure world today, the land continues to bless me with undeserving peace and kindness. I'm at a loss for words today, but the black-capped chickadees and northern cardinals brought me the escape I needed. Here's another quote from someone else who's quarantined in southern Ontario. This person writes, I'm realizing that times of isolation and sacrifice are excellent times for cultivating gratitude. And then the last quote I want to read you is from another young student who lives up at Wissahickon First Nation. And she writes, during this time, I feel especially grateful for the access I have to this environment, to this land. I can walk kilometers into the bush and still abide by social distancing orders. So one of the things we've found is that this sitting spot exercise, which was conceived of in pre-pandemic times, has proved particularly useful for students in their coping from day to day during this time now. As I alluded to earlier, this is not a new tradition. These are not new practices. Other peoples have recognized the value in thinking deeply about what affects them while out on the land. Just to mention two, I'm thinking of the rivers and mountains poets of 8th century Tang Dynasty China, the desert fathers of 4th century Christianity. They actually coined a wonderful term to describe this practice called otium sanctum, which means a holy leisure. And they believed that there was nothing finer than wasting time outside with no particular agenda and letting your mind go wherever it wants to. One writer, John Cassian, early Christian father, referred to this, compared this to be like a bit of down carried off on the breeze. So this is a very old human practice we have of taking time to sit still, to be alone with our thoughts, in a place where we are not truly alone. One of the questions that this sort of contemplative practice asks of us is, what shows itself in the long look? When we really take time to think deeply about our lives and the forces that affect our lives, what shows itself? Slowing down and sitting alone with the world suggests there are deep patterns that can reveal themselves to us. Slowing down and sitting alone with the world is the basis of pedagogy and character formation in a number of different societies. I think thinking about this particular sitting spot activity in terms of these other wisdom traditions of human antiquity gives us access to something deeper in ourselves and deeper in the world. It connects us to human beings whose lives have already concluded. One of the fascinating elements about the moment we're living through right now is its open-ended duration. Because we've been quarantined now for upwards of 6 weeks, it means that so much more can get in and affect us. It means that we're not engaging with nature on our terms, but according to a different kind of calendar. This allows for a more organic and natural process. We may be surprised by what we encounter from one day to the next, never knowing what we'll find, what will be shown, what will become apparent to us in our thinking. And part of the practice of having a sitting spot, part of contemplative practice itself, I think conditions in us an acceptance of variability and an acceptance that things change, things move, that the situation we live within in pre-pandemic time or not is always fluid and ever-changing. I mentioned earlier in a conversation, you know, my wife and my daughter and I were out in the green space behind our house a few days ago, middle of the day, and we saw a heron fishing over in the nearby pond. And as my little daughter was over watching the heron, my wife and I saw a bat fly overhead, very unusual in the daytime, and a raven swoop down and grab the bat out of midair and kill it right in front of us. This was a very big web of life kind of moment that I don't think we would have seen had we just slotted in and scheduled a visit to the park among the million other activities we would have had in pre-pandemic times. So it brings us, these moments can bring us closer to the truth of where we live and of who we are. So the question that I keep coming back to, and I think this is a good place in which to wrap, is what reveals itself through the long look? And as I've suggested, one of the things revealed to us is that we're a part of something so much bigger than ourselves. For the contemplative, that which is bigger than us is also alive, inherently meaningful, and profoundly intelligent.
Thank you, Mark, very much for that insight into the contemplative value of nature and the importance of reflection. Mike, I think you have a very different perspective, and perhaps I would ask what your response to Mark would be in context of his comments.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that there are a number of points of difference. Mark mentioned that he was speaking from a very particular place, and I am speaking from a different place, geographically speaking. So I live in Toronto, which is a very different context, and also a different sort of scholarly commitments and background. So what I sort of want to highlight with respect to nature in this sort of time of COVID is kind of motivated by a few questions. So what I've been thinking a lot about is sort of who gets to encounter nature and under what kinds of conditions, and how are these encounters mediated? And I'm thinking about this, specifically in the context of food, because that's what I study. And so this requires maybe just a very brief explanation about how I see food as nature. One of the sort of, I guess, theoretical and conceptual commitments that I have is I share those commitments with political ecologists who see nature as in fact socio-nature, so that this idea of a sort of pristine pre-human nature is really only in our thoughts and doesn't actually exist anymore in the world, and that everything from the tip of the North Pole, which is being impacted by global climate change, etc., to our city parks, etc., is actually just human impacted nature, that there's no longer a sort of pristine nature. And what they also suggest is that even things that we think of as not being natural are actually nothing but nature refracted through the labor process. So for example, this pen that I'm holding right here, there's nothing from outer space in it. It's all sourced from our natural world and created by humans through the labor process. So we can think of food, I think, usefully within this context of socio-nature, from the broccoli that comes to our table, even to the fish crackers that my kids are such a fan of eating. Even those are nature, even though they're not necessarily healthy for you. So that's just a brief bit of background. And as I've been sort of observing the swift and staggering effects that COVID-19 has had on our food system, there's a few things that have sort of jumped out to me in terms of how this crisis has impacted the kinds of encounters people are having with food natures specifically. So I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. I just have a couple of pictures. And I'm going to talk about three different, I guess, positions of food systems, from sort of production perspective, a consumption perspective, and then a leisure perspective at the end, because we encounter food in all different kinds of ways. Three of the ways in which we might encounter it is through production, consumption, and leisure. So the first I want to talk about, just very briefly, is the impact that COVID has had on production domestically. So the picture on the left here, I'll start with one on the right. So this is Cargill Foods, a very large meat processing factory in Alberta that many of us may have heard about in the news. Linked to more than 1,200 cases of COVID, and over 800 of those are workers. The other 400 or so are family members, etc. This one plant, it's been shut down for about 2 weeks, and this has cut off 36% of Canada's beef supply. If you add in the other two massive corporatized beef production plants in Alberta, that totals 90% of Canada's beef supply chain in just 3 factories. So this is quite concerning, obviously. This level of sort of consolidation, corporate consolidation, leaves very little resiliency in our food system. And I think that as we transition out of COVID, we'll need to think more seriously about this idea of resilience in our food systems. And that may compel people to think more seriously about localized food systems. So the plants are, the corporate owners of the plants, 2 of which are American, one is a Brazilian company, are obviously fighting to open the plants back up, and this is being resisted by the unions. Very rightfully so, because the workers are simply not safe. So the workers in these factories are encountering a particular kind of corporatized, industrialized nature every single day in these beef products, and very clearly being put at great risk to their own health. Again, over 1,200 cases connected to this plant alone. But it isn't only an issue of sort of industrial meat production. We also see this in vegetables as well. So the picture on the left of the screen is from Green Hill Produce. As you see in the subheadline here, mostly temporary foreign workers, 47 out of the 250 employees that they have here have tested positive for COVID and threaten, again, a vegetable supply chain, a very important one. This particular plant is in the Kent County area, but that whole region of sort of extreme sort of southern Ontario, Kent County, Leamington area, produces a lot of vegetables for us. And again, many of these very large scale greenhouse operations are being threatened as well by COVID. And workers, many of them temporary foreign workers, are being put at risk every single day in their encounters with these particular kinds of food nature. Now, very quickly about consumption. This is the Davenport Perth Neighborhood and Community Health Center. I live about 2 blocks from here. If we were just to pan right a bit, we would see the Stop Community Food Center. These are 2 organizations that are located right next door to each other. And in pre-pandemic times, what you would see here is this was a place for people to congregate. They would often pick up meals from the Stop Community Food Center and sit here to socialize and eat and everything else. So these are people who are living in insecure housing situations or just homeless, living rough. And their access to these little bits of urban nature here, these little urban parks, has been completely restricted. So you can see that the city officials have explicitly wrapped up the benches to not allow people to sit or sleep or congregate at all. The Stop Community Food Center, part of what they try to do is to address systemic inequalities in our food system, not only provide emergency food services. And so they run something called the Economic Justice Project. As part of this project, they train economic justice advocates. So people who live in the neighborhood, who are living on low incomes or who are homeless, etc. And they train them to become justice advocates. And one of them recently wrote a reflection for the Stop Community Food Center blog. And I'll just read a couple sentences what she wrote to put some of this into perspective. So she says, a 14-day quarantine is not in the cards when you have to travel outside every day for free meals because you cannot afford any food. Panic buying is not in the budget. Sitting at home with our stockpile of food and toilet paper is a luxury that many of us don't have. Having any kind of home is a luxury many of us don't have. So that's her reflection, on sort of this idea that we all sit at home with our stockpiles of food and toilet paper. It's just not, realistic for many people in our society. She also writes that if you breach the new sort of pandemic rules with respect to doing things in parks you're not meant to be doing, you face a $750 fine. And she says, a $750 fine for sitting on a bench. That's an entire month's Ontario Works payment. Who comes up with these crazy numbers, she says. So you can see again that those of us who are living fairly insecurely previous to the pandemic, and those who are being made quite precarious in the midst of it, are denied access to certain kinds of urban nature. And even as she observes, eating the food that she picks up at the stop in this park is now not something that she can do. So she can't encounter nature in the kinds of ways that she has been able to before to consume her food. Just one more quick sort of vignette here. So this is Trinity Bellwoods Park in downtown Toronto. And as you can see here, there's been some fencing erected around the sakura cherry trees. So around this time of year, each year, there are many cherry trees in the city, obviously across the province, and they all bloom right around now. And this is usually a time for celebration, and people sort of convene with these trees and take pictures and selfies, etc. And that is no longer allowed. You can see fences there. I'm going to pull up this link as well. What we have in High Park, where there is a large stand of these trees as well, is I'll just bring it up here if I can. We have there's a full screen. We have a 24-hour bloom cam in High Park, as it's called. The entire park of High Park, almost 400 acres, has been shut down, in fact, completely. Despite the fact that these sakura cherry trees really are in a very small, maybe sort of 200-meter stretch, kind of at the bottom lower end of the park. But in fact, the city of Toronto has shut down the entire park, not allowing people access to this urban nature. It's kind of worth noting as well that many of these sakura cherry trees that we see across Toronto were actually gifted to Toronto by the Japanese ambassador to Canada in 1959, just after the Second World War, to thank Toronto for taking in many Japanese refugees, essentially, during the war years. And so these trees are a sign of a post-crisis. Oh, we can see a City of Toronto vehicle there, I guess probably surveilling to make sure that people aren't, that people are complying with the rules. But these trees are around the city. So we see them in downtown parks. At York University has many of these cherry trees that were gifted from the Japanese ambassador, and they represent in some ways the bookend of a crisis. The Second World War, and now they are being, in this crisis, we are being sort of severed from them quite dramatically from this kind of urban nature, this kind of urban food nature. So as I reflect on who has access to what kinds of nature and how this access is mediated, let me just unshare my screen here. These are just some of the reflections that I've been having.
Excellent.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's quite a different understanding. It's certainly not a contemplated oneness, that opportunity of being one in nature that COVID presents, but systematically of a perhaps a more broken and dysfunctional relationship that COVID-19 reveals. I'm going to turn first to Mark and ask what you make of Mike's position. Mark, have you got some responses to that?
I do. I think it's harrowing. It is harrowing to be told of the situation on the ground in Toronto, and to get a sense for just how limited your movements there are, especially as somebody with, is it 3 children?
Yeah.
That's a very different situation from that of other communities. Mm-hmm. The urgency and the harrowing nature of your situation, I find very powerful, and there is nothing there that I take issue with. I wanted to ask you a question. Earlier on, you talked about the theoretical and conceptual commitments that you have as a thinker. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, because I think it is germane to this notion of the contemplative tradition that I've brought up. Is there an activist commitment for you as well when it comes to food security and food systems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, when we were talking last week, I think I'd mentioned that in many ways, many of the people that I work with in Peterborough and Toronto are busier now than ever for the obvious reasons that food insecurity is becoming far more acute for far more people than it ever has been. local numbers in Peterborough in terms of those accessing food. I mean, people are citing like 100% more people, these kinds of numbers. And at the same time, that's being complicated by the fact that many of these organizations rely on volunteers who are often of a more vulnerable age demographic, and so many of them have been asked to stay home. So some of these programs have, in fact, in Peterborough, had to shut down for and this is true across Canada as well. Programs have had to actually shut down at the time of perhaps the greatest need in the last, since food banks emerged, in this country in the early 1980s. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is, I think that this is part of that kind of activist sentiment and sort of perspective is very present in my thinking about these things as well, because I do see many of the people that I work with scrambling right now and being sort of working very, very hard to try to address these sort of immediate needs.
Yeah. So you are volunteering yourself at a food bank, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I volunteer at the Stop Community Food Center, one that I mentioned earlier, and I had been doing, I guess, more systems-focused work, sort of social change work with them, but that work was suspended as well, so they could sort of consolidate their efforts on emergency food provisioning. I also think I mentioned earlier when we were speaking that when I first started doing that about 7 weeks ago, working in the food bank specifically, I think I was packing about 28 boxes a week, and just this week I think it was 60. So there's been a quite an increase in demand. I mean, that's just anecdotal from my own sort of experience, but it seems to be backed up by many other sort of anecdotal accounts about the increase in need in our communities.
I think the anecdotal is really important, and I'm wondering if you would do us the service of walking us into a particular story, a particular anecdote, a particular moment, even just a small moment that stands out for you as a volunteer during these times, because it's clear to me that this is not a purely academic pursuit for you, and I applaud that. I'm not denigrating that at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I think a few weeks ago. So of course they have different programs. They try to tailor to the extent that they can to particular kinds of families, particular kinds of people who need particular kinds of foods, and they have a program for new mothers, and in those boxes, you're giving out, there's little bottles of baby formula and diapers and these kinds of things, and that was for me something, I guess, quite sort of visceral. As you mentioned earlier, I have 3 very young children, and one of whom is still in diapers, and so I mean that is. Yeah, I mean, I guess a sort of flashbulb moment for me, I guess, when I think about, hopefully when we pull out of this and over the years, things sort of get better. But I think that will be sort of a flashbulb moment for me in this time for sure.
Mike, having said that, what do you then make of Mark's perspective? Because it's certainly a focus at a different level and different scale. Mm-hmm. What about a more contemplative, larger look at the concept of the natural world and our relationship to it? Do you think there's some potential there for fixing any of the sort of inequities and broken relationships that translate down to the level that you've been observing and experiencing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I mean, Mark, one of the things that you said that I think is very true, and I wonder if you would just sort of talk a bit more about this, is you said that it's very difficult to sort of universalize right now because we potentially that was true pre-pandemic, but maybe it's more true now. And I wonder if you could reflect on that, because I found that idea, yeah, just sort of very compelling. Because I think that it, I mean, I don't want to say it sounds compelling because it sort of, it's something that I agree with, but it does seem to me that there's something there, and I wonder if you would just talk a bit more about that.
Well, the number of cases in Peterborough is still less than 100. The number of confirmed infections, close to 40 of which have already been resolved. I know there was a very modest spike reported 2 days ago, an additional 13, 15 cases or so. But our numbers have remained, thankfully, minuscule compared to other places, other cities, even just in Canada. I know that's the case in Northern Ontario as well, where the virus has made very few inroads. You know, around here, you know, in the sort of post-war neighborhood I live in Peterborough, you know, the green spaces are all open. Playgrounds are closed, of course, but the main Trans-Canada Trail, the Rotary Trail behind us here is open. There are people of every age on the trail. More than ever do you see people engaging with the outside. We're not being punished or ticketed or fined exorbitant amounts for sitting on park benches. It's a very different sort of reality here. The hospital is not overwhelmed. There's only been, I think, there's been 2 deaths in Peterborough. There's 1 case in ICU total. So it is not impacting us to the same extent. And I think that will have important political ramifications down the road the longer that this quarantine lasts. I think the harder it will be to convince people that they do need to take adequate precautions. You know, we went for a drive a couple of weeks into the quarantine after having been under house arrest, you know, for 14 days straight, whatever it was. And, you know, we were astonished by what we saw when we drove down one of the main thoroughfares. Tim Hortons drive-through, of course, is still open and backed up around the corner. The Walmart parking lot was 3/4 full. It was the same amount of traffic that you'd sort of see out and about on any Sunday, you know, come mid-afternoon. So it's a very different context here. Most people are taking it seriously. Some people maybe not so much, but I don't think we live with the same immediacy here, or I should say there are at least corners in our lives where we can go and the pandemic feels quite far away. You know, I did we go shopping for groceries once every 2 weeks to sort of, you know, do our part to not engage with any sort of civic space. And there, you know, you do feel more of a sense of urgency because the plexiglass is up and 30%, but only 30%, if that, of the people are wearing surgical masks. So there, you know, you do feel it a little bit more, but we have space here. And the people that you see in the park, as I said, are of every background, all ethnicities, people in motorized wheelchairs. So we're very fortunate, I think, in that regard. Accessibility has not been hindered by this in certain places. There's still places we can go, and it feels normal, you know?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Maybe just a follow up as well, and I guess maybe here, you know, soliciting advice. Maybe, you know, you mentioned your assignment, the you know, the sitting place assignment, which to me, I mean, it sounds like just a really great assignment. But I wonder if it's also could be an exercise in self-care in some ways in these sort of hectic and uncertain times. You know, I think about, you know, despite the fact that Peterborough is seemingly fairly normal, you know, as you describe it, if, you know, presumably people are still a little more anxious nowadays than than is typically the case. If you flick on the news or scroll through your Twitter feed, you may experience a similar feeling to me, and that is a sort of a rising sort of anxiety. And it strikes me that part of what your analysis suggests and reveals is that convening with nature in a sort of contemplative way is healing in some ways. So I wonder if you have any suggestions for me and for us about how we might, hone our own practice in terms of, convening and contemplating with nature in ways that would be, beneficial from a sort of self-care perspective at this moment.
Okay. Well, a couple of things come to mind. I think it's a good question. The first thing that I would like to say is that it's important to remember, as I suggested earlier, that this isn't a sort of a modern Western practice that's been grafted onto an industrial framework. So I'm not talking about the sort of boilerplate romanticism that began to flourish in the 1800s in England. I mentioned earlier it was an Indigenous student of mine, Haudenosaunee young woman, who suggested to me that we take up this practice for that particular course. And my best ideas for my courses always come from my students, right? They're the ones who really sound things out at a deep level and come back to me and say, you should really do this. Really do this instead. So it's important, I think, to remember the antiquity of the practice. I want to go to your point about self-care. And I think that, there's a risk here that self-care becomes a matter of self-indulgence, and that a larger politic drops away as a result of that self-indulgence or that preoccupation with the self. One of the things one of my Anishinaabe teachers told me once is that, you always start with yourself. And if you have anything left over, then you share that with your family. And if you have anything left over after that, then it goes to your community. And if there's anything left over after that, then it goes to your nation. But care of the self is considered a bedrock to good citizenship, at least to a good Anishinaabe version of citizenship. So I think it's important to sort of recognize the double-edged nature of self-care and how it can tip over into something that's just merely about self-gratification. The other thing I wanted to sort of bring back to conscious awareness, the sitting spot does not abide by that westernized dichotomy whereby we consider nature to be out there, whereas we are in here. So with the sitting spot exercise, we're not insisting on any hard and fast dualism between nature and civilization. I think I mentioned in one of our conversations that the sitting spot can be, here, me by my window, looking out onto this, as I said earlier, sort of post-war, kind of grubby, kind of charming street here in Peterborough. In fact, I had a student of mine this last semester, very active young man who blew out his knee and was confined to his house, was confined to his second floor apartment, to his chair. And that was his sitting spot, right? He pushed his chair up against the window and looked out his window for the semester because he couldn't walk. He couldn't go anywhere. And, his journal was just full of all kinds of really funny insights and observations. He thought about getting a pair of binoculars, and then he decided against it because he thought, his neighbors would think that was too weird because maybe they'd think he was spying on them a la Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window. So the sitting spot can be anywhere. It can be a window. It doesn't have to be a green space. And on that note, can you share that story? Because I think it's so wonderful about your daughters and their window and what's been happening by their bedroom window.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. So since this happened last week, they're very diligently look out the window every night now. So yeah, last week, it's my daughter and my son, actually, my two oldest. Often we'll look out the window at night after we put them to bed and, sort of wind down by themselves for a bit. And last week, they came rushing back downstairs where I was and said that they had seen a cat on our across the street neighbor's roof. And so I, went up to sort of observe this cat with him. And it turns out that it was actually a raccoon, which makes a lot more sense in the first place. And so we watched this raccoon together for 15 minutes, and then the raccoon eventually sort of ambled off. And I went back downstairs, but about 10 minutes later, the raccoon returned, and so they hurriedly ran down and excitedly told me that the raccoon had returned. But it does provide them with a lot of entertainment to peer out the windows in the evening.
Go ahead, Heather.
Well, I don't want to interrupt this great exchange, but I'm just thinking that I'm seeing such a lot of points of intersection in between these two discussions. One has focusing more initially last week when we were talking more about the large systemic problems of that capitalism and its interaction with sort of natural exploitation has sort of been revealed through a lot of the crisis that we've been going through over the last couple of months, and then Mark talking more about that crisis of what we used to call, when back in the dark ages when I was doing my graduate work in environmentalism, the relationship, the hubris in terms of our relationship to the natural world, and yet yet it seems to me that the notion of the big system, broken system, and the individual relationship to the natural world, and how have been the potential to rediscover it over the last little while. I mean, it seems to me there's common points here. Are you finding common intersections in the way that you're now? I mean, it seems to me that we've had, have beginning to tease this out in the conversation.
Well, I think that, I have so much respect for what Michael is doing, and I have so much respect for the life on the line sense of urgency that he brings to the work. And I would suggest that Michael is himself a contemplative. It's only recently that we separated the long look of contemplation from social justice. Mm-hmm. If you go back in time, so many of the major spiritual leaders that have emerged from the human family have been ardently committed to social justice causes. I go back to that question I posed earlier, what is revealed in the long look? The contemplative doesn't necessarily fixate their gaze on non-human nature. They can also look out the window at urban wildlife, and they can also look out through a conceptual window at the large systemic problems that capitalism has produced. So I'm tempted to sort of suggest that Michael actually might be even more of a contemplative than me, because as is said in a Christian context, God is never, to introduce perhaps a scary word, but God is never found at the banquet. God is never inside the tent where the bright lights are, where the feast is being held, where the wine is being drunk. God is always outside in the darkness, where the beggars are, where the street people are. That's where you're closest to a kind of holiness. And so I think Michael actually perhaps does the work of a social justice contemplative far better than I do. And when I think of his analysis, when I look at some of the figures that he's raised, some of the points he raised in his talk, 90% of Canada's beef supply potentially threatened by COVID-19, all the rest of it, he's looking long and hard into the darkness. And I think by their nature, contemplatives are not afraid of the dark, and they dare themselves to look into the dark. Mm-hmm. I have other things to say, but maybe that's enough for this particular moment. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a very kind and generous analysis of what I do, Mark. I appreciate that. I also, I think, speaking with you, recalling our discussion from last week, what I've really appreciated is, a chance to be maybe more contemplative than I feel like sometimes I have time for. I think that's not something that scholars should do, is neglect sort of contemplation. And I was also going to return to this, what reveals itself through the long look, quote that you just were sort of riffing on, by way of sort of tying it into praxis. So this idea of learning by doing, thinking, doing, the sort of cyclical, process. And I was thinking, colloquially, when we say, let me have a look at that. I'm thinking, say, if my son brings me a toy and says, "Oh, this is broken," I'll say, "Let me have a look at that." And I won't just actually look at it. What I'll do is I'll take it from him and hold it in my hands and do, not just look. So as I was thinking about this idea of what reveals itself through the long look, it seems to me that also implies doing in some ways. But there's a sort of praxis element to this, to this prescription. And I think that it's important also to recognize that contemplating is doing. You might not be holding a toy in your hand, fixing it, but even thinking is doing. And I think that's very important to keep in mind as well. I think particularly in this era of sort of anti-science perspectives, anti-intellectualism that we see so rampant, I think that thinking is also a profoundly political act as well. There's a politics to thinking.
Absolutely.
And which is increasingly important, unfortunately, because it is never that we get to do this work. It's easy to take for granted, maybe, but we should never take it for granted, because there are many threats, of course, to the academy, from the banal of sort of like funding issues, etc., to the much more sort of profound, like this sort of prevailing sentiment of anti-intellectualism, etc. So I think contemplating is important political work as well.
Yeah. And it makes me think of, just very quickly, it makes me think, riffing off of what you were saying, Mike, that academics are positioned to be natural contemplatives, as you say. Oh yeah, let me take a look at that. Let me think about that.
Mm-hmm.
We are among the few in technological civilization who have access to that kind of space, that kind of time and space, where we can think things through on a deeper level,
Mm-hmm.
and arrive at that kind of deep structural understanding of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sort of reminds me, of the etymology or the origins of the word academy, and how we were talking about, the groves of trees, the groves of academia trees outside of ancient Athens, where Plato and Socrates and others would meet. So, the university began as an outdoor practice. It began out of doors, and, people sort of taking for themselves a bit of distance so that they could properly evaluate that societal world they belong to, and
Mm-hmm.
potentially, or not, nudge it in healthier directions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing that came to my mind, and this is just really just a footnote, but when we talk about food and we talk about food security, and we're sort of becoming cognizant, or we're being resensitized to the fact that maybe we need to take more responsibility over our own food supply. Anybody who has a garden, anybody who tends to flowers, anybody who grows vegetables knows that that is a very meditative, deeply meditative act, and that's another one of those little spaces for the contemplative today, just through gardening, through caring for other forms of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Heather, I think you're still on mute again.
This reminds me of a conversation that's taking part in another area of the world, which would be in the, you know, in the north, the circumpolar north and northern Canada, where you know, none of it today just reported its first you know, COVID-19 case. So arguably the north, and we'll see, because we don't have a crystal ball and we don't know what's going to happen, unfold there over the next little while, but the north in general has been coping less with this kind of pandemic crisis to provoke its, you know, changes in its relationship in natural world. It's been different because it's been dealing with climate change in ways that we in the South have not. And but yet, I mean, just sort of again playing off what the two of you have been talking about, what's been very striking, and in a way I see you saying, is that if you look at the change that's occurring, you know, the systems are not working the same way. And in the North, the discussion has shifted from talk about sustainable development, because we're now riding that relationship with the natural world that isn't going to be sustainable and steady. And we're talking about resiliency. And how do we shift and adapt and read the changes that are happening in the natural world, and then do a sociological analysis and understand the ways in which those two systems, which are really interconnected, and adapt to each other. And I think that in this sense, this is our moment in Southern Canada anyway, to you know, to start thinking about our relationship to the environment in resilient ways. You know, how can we be resilient? Where are our economic and social systems throwing up the roadblocks and the barriers to that resiliency, which is again a new form of a healthy relationship? So I do see that interaction in a sense between what you're both saying, I think, in similar and different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, do you want to go first on this one?
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
You know, climate change, I think, is an extraordinary opportunity for contemplative action to bring those two things together. You know, one of Michael's colleagues at York University, formerly at York University, Tim LeDuc, wrote an entire book on climate change in the North, and how it is making necessary a kind of dialogue between humans and their landscapes, which are so quickly changing. You know, when I think of resiliency, how do we strengthen resiliency? I think it is, of course, by strengthening relationship. So that connection between resiliency and relationship needs to be emphasized. You know, how do we strengthen our relationships to non-human nature? Well, you know, I've been sort of talking about the long look, the long look of the contemplative. We pay close attention to our surroundings and how our surroundings are changing. And if we do that, then I think we are better able to move with those surroundings in their changes. So I think there is an opportunity through climate change to increase our awareness of the kind of reciprocal, contrapuntal relationship that we need to have with our surroundings at any time to be here.
Mike?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with all that. Maybe the tack I'll take with this particular question or observation is, you know, to talk a bit about, you know, the folks in Peterborough that I've been working with for the last couple of years, you know, food systems advocates and activists, even pre-pandemic, were working within the context of crisis. You know, Peterborough has about 15% food insecurity, which is much higher than the provincial average. The loss of farmland and farming families in Peterborough and surrounding area is occurring more rapidly than elsewhere. You know, people often, you know, from Toronto are buying land and just taking out of production so they can have a sort of bucolic field behind them and not necessarily a, you know, an intensively produced landscape. So even before COVID, people had many activists and advocates in Peterborough, very committed, had been doing this work, planning for resiliency in the local food system, planning, you know, bracing for the impacts of climate change, strategizing for how to live in a rapidly changing world. And I think COVID has sort of, in some ways, complicated that work and shift the focus slightly, at least in the very immediate term. But I think in the the longer term perspective, this has I think it's invigorating people as well. It's adding another level of urgency in some ways to the work, and that is I think a key element of resiliency is that sort of sociological piece that you mentioned, Heather, is that how do we organize life in different ways socially, in ways that are not sort of based on capitalist ways of knowing the world, exchange value, etc. This isn't something that's obvious. I don't think it's not something that we just know how to do. We have to learn how to do this work, and this kind of goes back in some ways to praxis as well. How do you work with people and organize and move the ball on policy or programs, or inch by inch working with other people collaboratively? That's something I think that we'll all need to learn a lot more about in the coming years, if we are to be a more resilient society.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think on that note, we should probably wrap up this fascinating conversation. Have we got any last thoughts? Anything?
I'll just say, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. It was great. I really appreciate this discussion. I hope we can do more.
Thank you so much for doing this. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.